The Lady with the Dog by Anton Chekhov. Part 1. People were talking about a new arrival on the boardwalk, a lady with a little dog. Dmitry Dmitrich Gurov, who had already been in Yalta for 2 weeks and felt quite at home, began to notice the newcomers. Sitting in Verny's pavilion, he saw a young, fair-haired woman of average height walking along the seafront. She wore a beret, and a small white Pomeranian dog was trailing behind her. He started seeing her frequently in the public gardens and in the square. She was always alone, always wearing the same beret, and always with the same white dog. No one knew who she was. They simply called her the lady with the dog. If she's here alone, without a husband or friends, it might be interesting to get to know her, Gurov thought. He was under 40, with a 12-year-old daughter and 2 sons in school. He had married young, when he was in his 2nd year of university, and now his wife seemed much older than him. She was tall, with dark eyebrows, very serious, and considered herself intellectual. She read a lot, used proper spelling, called her husband by the formal Dmitri instead of Dmitri, and he secretly found her boring, narrow-minded, and unattractive. He was afraid of her and didn't like being at home. He had been unfaithful to her for a long time. Many times in fact, and probably because of that, he often spoke poorly of women, calling them the inferior race. He felt that his life experiences had made him cynical, allowing him to say whatever he wanted about women. Yet, he couldn't go 2 days without needing to be around them. In the company of men, he was bored and distant. But with women he felt at ease, knew how to talk to them, and was comfortable even in silence. There was something about him, his looks, his personality, his whole demeanor, that women found attractive, and he knew it. He was naturally drawn to them. Over the years, he had learned that with decent people, especially those from Moscow who were slow to act and hesitant, what starts as a fun, light adventure can quickly become a complicated, messy problem. But every time he met an interesting woman, he forgot these lessons and was eager to live in the moment, where everything seemed simple and enjoyable. One evening, while dining in the gardens, the lady with the beret sat down at the table next to him. From her expression, the way she walked, her clothes and her hairstyle, Gurov could tell she was a lady. She was married, it was her first time in Yalta, and she was lonely there. He had heard stories about the immorality in places like Yalta, but he didn't believe them. He knew those stories were mostly made up by people who would have sinned themselves if they could. But when the lady sat down just a few feet away, he remembered these tales of easy conquests and quick, fleeting romances with unknown women, and the idea of having a brief affair with her suddenly seemed very appealing. He motioned to her Pomeranian, and when the dog came over, he playfully shook his finger at it. The Pomeranian growled, and Gurov shook his finger at it again. The lady glanced at him and quickly looked away. "He doesn't bite," she said, blushing. "May I give him a bone?" he asked. When she nodded, he politely added, "Have you been in Yalta long?" 5 days. I've already been here for 2 weeks. There was a brief silence. Time goes by fast, but it's so boring here, she said without looking at him. It's just fashionable to say it's boring here. A provincial person will live in a small town and not be bored, but when they come here, it's all oh how dull. Oh, the dust. As if they came from some exotic place. She laughed. They both continued eating in silence, like strangers, but after dinner, they walked together. They started a light, playful conversation, the kind that happens between people who are free and content, who don't care where they go or what they talk about. They walked and talked about the strange light on the sea, which was a soft, warm lilac color, with a golden streak from the moon on the water. They talked about how hot it was after a long, warm day. Gurov told her he was from Moscow, that he had a degree in arts but worked at a bank, that he had trained as an opera singer but gave it up, and that he owned 2 houses in Moscow. From her, he learned that she grew up in St. Petersburg but had lived in a small town since her marriage 2 years ago. She was staying in Yalta for another month, and her husband, who also needed a vacation, might come to pick her up. She wasn't sure if her husband worked for a government department or for the provincial council, and she found her own ignorance amusing. Gurov also learned her name was Anna Sergeyevna. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Gurov thought about her. He was sure he would see her again the next day. It seemed inevitable. As he got into bed, he thought about how recently she must have been a schoolgirl, just like his own daughter doing her lessons. He remembered the shyness and awkwardness that still showed in her laughter and in how she talked to strangers. This must have been the first time in her life she had been alone in a place where people followed her, looked at her, and spoke to her with intentions she could probably guess. He thought of her slender, delicate neck and her beautiful gray eyes. There's something sad about her, he thought, and then fell asleep. Part 2. A week had passed since Gurov and Anna Sergeyevna first met. It was a holiday, but the weather was unbearably hot inside, and outside, the wind was kicking up dust, swirling it around, and knocking hats off people's heads. It was one of those days where you just felt thirsty all the time. Gurov kept suggesting they go into the pavilion for a cold drink or an ice cream to cool off, but it was hard to know what to do with themselves. That evening, when the wind finally calmed down a bit, they decided to walk out to the pier to watch the steamer come in. The harbor was packed with people, many holding bouquets, waiting to greet someone special. The crowd was filled with elderly ladies dressed like they were much younger and a surprising number of generals. Because the sea was rough, the steamer arrived late, after sunset, and it took a while to maneuver before docking at the pier. Anna Sergeyevna looked at the steamer and its passengers through her lorgnette, as if searching for someone she knew. When she turned to Gurov, her eyes were sparkling. She chatted a lot, asking random questions and then forgetting she had even asked them. In the crowd, she accidentally dropped her lorgnette. As the festive crowd began to disperse, it became too dark to see faces clearly. The wind had died down completely, but Gurov and Anna Sergeyevna stayed where they were, almost as if they were waiting for someone else to appear from the steamer. Anna Sergeyevna grew quiet and smelled the flowers she was holding, not looking at Gurov. "The weather's nicer now," Gurov said. "Should we go for a drive somewhere?" She didn't respond. Gurov looked at her closely, then suddenly put his arm around her and kissed her on the lips. inhaling the fresh scent of the flowers she was holding. He quickly glanced around, worried that someone might have seen them. "Let's go to your hotel," he whispered. They both started walking quickly. The room was stuffy and smelled of the perfume Anna Sergeyevna had bought from the Japanese shop. As Gurov looked at her, he thought, "You meet all kinds of people in this world." He remembered the women from his past, some who were cheerful and grateful for the brief happiness he gave them, others like his wife who loved with no real feeling, and some beautiful but cold women who always seemed to want more from life than it could give. But with Anna Sergeyevna, there was something different, a sense of awkwardness, inexperience, and a hint of sadness, as if something had gone wrong. Anna Sergeyevna, the lady with the dog, seemed deeply affected by what had happened between them. She looked as if she was carrying a heavy burden, her face downcast, her long hair hanging sorrowfully on either side of her face. She seemed like a woman from an old painting, lost in thought and guilt. "This is wrong," she said. "You must despise me now." There was a watermelon on the table. Gurov casually cut a slice and began eating it, taking his time. Neither of them spoke for at least half an hour. There was something touching about Anna Sergeyevna, an innocence and simplicity that made her seem pure, like someone who hadn't experienced much of life. The dim light from the single candle on the table showed just how unhappy she was. "How could I despise you?" Gurov asked gently. "You don't know what you're saying." "God forgive me," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "This is terrible. It sounds like you feel you need forgiveness." "Forgiveness? No. I'm a bad, low person. I despise myself and don't even try to justify what I've done. It's not my husband I've deceived, it's myself. And not just now. I've been deceiving myself for a long time. My husband might be a good, honest man, but he's just a flunky. I don't even know what he does for work, but I know he's a flunky. I was only 20 when I married him, and I was driven by curiosity. I wanted something better. I kept telling myself, there must be more to life. I wanted to live. To really live. But you wouldn't understand that. I swear to God, I just couldn't control myself. I told my husband I was sick, and came here. And since I got here, I've been wandering around in a daze, like I've lost my mind. And now, I've become a vulgar, contemptible woman, someone anyone could look down on." Gurov was already feeling bored listening to her. Her naive tone, this sudden out-of-place remorse, it irritated him. If it weren't for the tears in her eyes, he might have thought she was joking or putting on an act. "I don't get it," he said softly. "What do you want?" She hid her face against his chest and clung to him. "Believe me, please believe me," she begged. "I want a pure, honest life, and sin disgusts me. I don't know what I'm doing. Simple people say, the devil made me do it. And I feel like I can say the same about myself now." "Shoo, shoo," he murmured. He looked into her wide, scared eyes, kissed her, spoke to her softly, and gradually she began to calm down. Soon, they were both laughing again. Later, when they went out, the seafront was deserted. The town, with its cypresses, seemed lifeless, but the sea was still noisily crashing on the shore. A single barge was rocking on the waves, and a lantern on it blinked sleepily. They found a cab and headed to Oranda. "I saw your last name on the board in the hall just now, von Dideritz," Gurov said. "Is your husband German?" "No, I think his grandfather was German, but he's Russian Orthodox." At Oranda, they sat on a bench near the church, gazing down at the sea in silence. Yalta was barely visible through the morning mist, and white clouds hung still on the mountain tops. The leaves on the trees didn't stir, grasshoppers chirped, and the steady hollow sound of the sea rising from below spoke of peace, of the eternal rest that awaits us all. It must have sounded like this when there was no Yalta, no Oranda. It sounds like this now, and it will sound just as indifferent and monotonous when we're all gone. And in that constancy, in that complete indifference to the life and death of each of us, maybe there's a promise of our eternal salvation, of the never-ending movement of life on earth, of never-ending progress toward perfection. Sitting beside a young woman who seemed so lovely in the dawn, comforted and enchanted by these magical surroundings, the sea, mountains, clouds, and the open sky, Gurov thought about how everything in this world is truly beautiful when you reflect on it. Everything except what we think or do when we forget our human dignity and the higher purposes of our existence. A man walked up to them, probably a caretaker, looked at them, and walked away. Even this small detail seemed mysterious and beautiful. They saw a steamer arriving from Theodosia, its lights barely visible in the morning glow. "There's dew on the grass," Anna Sergeyevna said after a long silence. "Yes. It's time to go back." They returned to the town. After that, they met every day at noon on the seafront, had lunch and dinner together, took walks, and admired the sea. Anna Sergeyevna often complained about sleeping poorly and her heart racing. She asked the same questions repeatedly, sometimes troubled by jealousy, other times by the fear that Gurov didn't respect her enough. Often, when they were alone in the square or gardens, he would suddenly pull her close and kiss her passionately. The idleness, these public kisses in broad daylight, the heat, the smell of the sea, and the constant presence of well-dressed, well-fed people passing by, turned Gurov into a new man. He told Anna Sergeyevna how beautiful she was, how captivating. He was impatiently passionate, refusing to step away from her, while she often seemed deep in thought and kept asking him to admit that he didn't respect her, didn't love her at all, and thought of her as just an ordinary woman. Nearly every evening, they would take a drive out of town, to Oranda or the waterfall, and the outings were always a success, the scenery always impressing them as grand and beautiful. They were expecting her husband to arrive, but instead, she received a letter from him saying he had trouble with his eyes and begged her to come home as soon as possible. Anna Sergeyevna quickly made arrangements to leave. "It's good that I'm going," she told Gurov. "It's fate." She left by carriage, and Gurov went with her. They traveled together all day. When she finally boarded her train, and the second bell rang, she said, "Let me look at you one last time. Just one more time. That's it." She didn't cry, but she looked so sad that she seemed sick, her face trembling. "I'll remember you. Think of you," she said. "God be with you. I hope you're happy. Don't remember me badly. We're parting forever. It has to be, because we shouldn't have met at all. Well, goodbye then." The train started moving, and she quickly walked to her car. Gurov stayed on the platform, watching the train until it was out of sight. He then returned to his hotel, slowly moving through the unfamiliar crowd, as though in a daze. In a few minutes, he noticed he had lost his way. He kept looking for the exit, and suddenly, a schoolboy ran up to him, asking for a handout. Part 3. Back in Moscow, life settled into its usual winter routine. The stoves were on, and it was still dark when the kids ate breakfast and got ready for school. The nurse would turn on a lamp for a bit in the mornings. The cold had set in, and the first snow had already fallen. On the first day of sledding, it was a joy to see everything covered in white, the ground, the rooftops, and to breathe in the crisp, refreshing air. The season brought back memories of younger days. The old linden and birch trees, now covered in frost, felt comforting, more familiar than the exotic cypresses and palms. Near them, Gurov didn't long for the sea or mountains. Gurov was a Moscow native, and he arrived on a clear, cold day. As he put on his fur coat and gloves, strolling along Petrovka Street, the charm of his recent trip faded. He quickly got caught up in the rhythm of Moscow life, devouring 3 newspapers a day and declaring he avoided local papers on principle. He soon found himself longing for the usual distractions: restaurants, clubs, dinners, and parties. He felt proud to host notable lawyers and artists, or to play cards with a professor at the doctor's club. He even found himself enjoying hearty Russian dishes like salted fish and cabbage. He thought that in a month or so, his memory of Anna Sergeyevna would fade, just like others before her, only resurfacing occasionally in dreams. But as more than a month passed and winter deepened, her image remained clear in his mind, as if they had just parted the day before. His memories of her grew more vivid. In the quiet evenings as he heard his children studying, or while listening to a song at a restaurant or the wind howling outside, everything would come back to him. Their time on the pier, the misty mornings in the mountains, the arrival of the steamer, and their kisses. He would wander around his room, lost in thought, smiling at the memories. Then, his thoughts would shift from what had happened to what might come next. Anna didn't just appear in his dreams. She followed him everywhere, like a shadow, haunting his every move. When he closed his eyes, he could see her clearly, more beautiful, younger, and more tender than she actually was. In his imagination, he also saw himself as better than he had been in Yalta. In the evenings, she seemed to appear from the bookshelf, the fireplace, or a corner of the room. He could almost hear her breathing or the soft rustle of her dress. On the street, he would glance at women, searching for someone who looked like her. He was overwhelmed by a strong urge to share his memories with someone. But at home, it was impossible to talk about his feelings, and he had no one else to confide in. Not his tenants or anyone at the bank. What could he even say? Was it love? Had there been anything truly beautiful, poetic, or meaningful in his relationship with Anna Sergeyevna? There was nothing to do but speak vaguely about love or women in general, and no one ever guessed what he really meant. Only his wife, raising her black eyebrows, would say, "The role of a lady killer doesn't suit you at all, Dmitri." One evening, after leaving the doctor's club with a colleague he'd been playing cards with, Gurov couldn't resist saying, "If you only knew the amazing woman I met in Yalta." The colleague got into his sledge and was driving away, but suddenly turned back and shouted, "Dmitri Dmitrich!" "What?" Gurov called back. "You were right tonight. The sturgeon was a bit too strong." Those ordinary words somehow filled Gurov with disgust, making him feel degraded. What savage manners, what people! What pointless nights and dull, uneventful days! The obsession with cards, the overeating, the drinking, the endless conversations about the same things. It all consumed the best part of his time and energy. In the end, life felt small, trivial, and inescapable, like being trapped in a madhouse or a prison. Gurov didn't sleep that night, feeling a deep sense of frustration. The next day, he had a headache and slept poorly the following night as well. He sat up in bed, thinking, or paced around his room. He grew tired of his children, tired of the bank, tired of everything. He didn't want to go anywhere or talk about anything. During the December holidays, Gurov prepared for a trip. He told his wife he was going to St. Petersburg to help a young friend with something and set off for the town of S. Why? He wasn't quite sure himself. He just wanted to see Anna Sergeyevna and talk to her, maybe arrange a meeting. He arrived in S. in the morning and booked the best room at the hotel. The room had a grey cloth-covered floor, and on the dusty table was an inkstand adorned with a headless horseman figure. The hotel porter gave him the information he needed. Von Dideritz lived in a house on Old Goncharny Street, not far from the hotel. He was wealthy, lived in style, and had his own horses. Everyone in town knew him. The porter pronounced the name as Dideritz. Gurov walked slowly to Old Goncharny Street and found the house. Across from it was a long grey fence lined with nails. One would want to run away from a fence like that, Gurov thought, glancing from the fence to the windows of the house and back again. He considered his options. It was a holiday, so Anna's husband was probably home. It would be rude to just drop in and risk upsetting her. If he sent a note, it might end up in her husband's hands and ruin everything. It was best to leave things to chance. So, he walked up and down the street, waiting for the right moment. He saw a beggar enter the gate, and dogs immediately started barking at him. An hour later, he heard faint piano music, probably Anna playing. Then the front door suddenly opened, and an old woman came out, followed by the familiar white Pomeranian. Gurov almost called out to the dog, but his heart began pounding, and in his nervousness, he couldn't remember the dog's name. He kept pacing back and forth, growing more and more frustrated with the grey fence. By now, he was irritated, thinking Anna had probably forgotten about him and was possibly seeing someone else. That would be understandable for a young woman who had nothing to look at all day but that dreadful fence. He returned to his hotel room, sat on the sofa for a while, unsure of what to do, then had dinner and took a long nap. How stupid and frustrating this is, he thought when he woke up and saw the dark windows. It was already evening. Here I've had a good sleep for no reason. What am I going to do all night? He sat on the bed, which was covered by a cheap grey blanket like those in hospitals, and mocked himself in his frustration. So much for the lady with the dog. So much for the adventure. You're in a nice mess now. That morning at the station, a poster for a performance of The Geisha had caught his eye. He thought about it and decided to go to the theater. She might go to the first performance, he thought. The theater was packed. Like all provincial theaters, there was a haze above the chandelier, and the gallery was noisy and restless. In the front row, the local dandies stood with their hands behind their backs before the performance started. The governor's daughter, wearing a boa, sat in the front seat of the governor's box, while the governor himself stayed modestly behind the curtain, with only his hands visible. The orchestra took a long time tuning up, and the stage curtain swayed. As the audience continued to file in and take their seats, Gurov watched eagerly. Anna Sergeyevna entered the theater and sat down in the third row. When Gurov saw her, his heart tightened. He realized with absolute clarity that in the entire world, there was no one closer, more precious, or more important to him than this little woman, who was so unremarkable and lost in the provincial crowd, with a cheap lorgnette in her hand. She filled his whole life now. She was his sorrow and his joy, the only happiness he desired. As the mediocre orchestra played its inferior music, he thought about how beautiful she was. He was lost in his thoughts, dreaming. A young man with small side whiskers, tall and slightly stooped, came in with Anna Sergeyevna and sat down beside her. He bent his head at every step, as if he were constantly bowing. This was probably her husband, the one she had bitterly called a flunky back in Yalta. There was indeed something subservient about his long figure, his side whiskers, and the small bald patch on his head. His smile was overly sweet, and he wore some kind of badge in his buttonhole, like a waiter's number. During the first intermission, the husband went outside to smoke, leaving Anna alone. Gurov, who was also sitting in the stalls, approached her and said in a trembling voice, with a forced smile, "Good evening." She looked at him and turned pale, then looked again in shock, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She tightly gripped her fan and lorgnette, clearly struggling to stay calm. They were both silent. She sat, not knowing what to do, while he stood, too nervous to sit next to her. The violins and flutes started tuning up. Suddenly, terror filled her face. She turned to him and quickly whispered, "For the love of God, go away. Go away. I beg you. They're watching us." She turned pale and became flustered, acting more agitated than if she had been caught stealing. "I swear, I didn't tell anyone. Everyone here knows. I'm lost. What will he think?" She seemed overwhelmed and lost her composure, staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. For the love of God, go away," she continued, trembling. "I'll come to see you. I swear. All night long I've been dreaming of seeing you again. And now I'm so happy, but I'm scared to death. Please go now." She looked at him with desperation, pleading with her eyes to go, and at that moment, the orchestra started playing again. Everyone returned to their seats, and he was forced to leave. Part 4. Anna Sergeyevna started visiting Gurov in Moscow every 2 or 3 months. She would tell her husband she was going to see a doctor for a health issue, and while he believed her, he also had his doubts. In Moscow, she stayed at the Slaviansky Bazaar Hotel and would immediately send a messenger to Gurov. He would visit her, and no one in Moscow knew about it. One winter morning, Gurov was on his way to meet her after receiving a message the night before. His daughter was with him, as he planned to drop her off at school on the way. The snow was falling in big, wet flakes. "It's just above freezing, but it's still snowing," Gurov said to his daughter. "The ground is warm, but higher up, it's much colder." "Why don't we have thunderstorms in the winter, Dad?" He explained, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was thinking about seeing Anna, about the secret life he led. No one knew about this other side of him, and he was sure no one ever would. He had 2 lives. One that was public, full of half-truths and the same routine as everyone else, and another that was hidden, where his real feelings and interests lived. After dropping off his daughter at school, Gurov went to the Slaviansky Bazaar. He took off his coat, went upstairs, and softly knocked on Anna's door. She opened it, wearing his favorite gray dress. She looked tired and anxious from her journey, and as soon as she saw him, she fell into his arms. Their kiss was long, as if they hadn't seen each other in years. "How are things going?" he asked. "Wait, I'll tell you. I just can't talk right now," she said, her voice choked with tears. She turned away and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Let her cry it out, he thought as he sat down. He ordered some tea and waited, watching her stand at the window, her back to him. She was crying, overwhelmed by the difficulty of their situation. They could only meet in secret, hiding like thieves. Was this really the life they wanted? "Come on, stop crying," he said gently. Gurov realized that their love wasn't going to fade anytime soon. Anna was growing more attached to him, and he couldn't imagine telling her that it might end one day. He went over to her, putting his hands on her shoulders to comfort her, and caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He noticed his hair was starting to turn gray. It struck him how much older he had become in the past few years. He felt a wave of compassion for both of them, knowing that their time together, while still full of warmth, might not last forever. Why did she love him so much? Women always seemed to love a version of him they created in their minds, and even when they realized he wasn't that person, they kept loving him. But none of them had ever been truly happy with him, and until now, he had never really been in love. Now, with Anna, it was different. They loved each other deeply, like a married couple or close friends, and couldn't understand why life had kept them apart with other partners. It felt like they were meant for each other, like birds trapped in separate cages. They forgave each other for their pasts and accepted each other's present. This love had changed them both. In the past, when Gurov felt down, he would come up with arguments to comfort himself, but now he didn't care about that. He just felt a deep compassion and wanted to be sincere and kind. "Don't cry, my love," he said. "You've cried enough. Let's talk now, let's figure out a plan." They spent a long time discussing how they could avoid the secrecy, the deception, and the long separations. How could they break free from this impossible situation? "How?" he asked, clutching his head. "How?" It seemed like they were close to finding an answer, a solution that would lead to a new, better life. But deep down, they both knew that the hardest part of their journey together was just beginning.
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.